Sahira moved through the sun-baked streets of her village with a calm that made the desert seem to sigh in relief. Children followed her shadow across the golden sand, and even the goats and camels paused in their grazing to glance her way. Her presence was a balm to those who labored under the scorching sun. Her smile brought laughter to the weary, and her voice, soft yet commanding, carried across the dunes as if the wind itself took delight in her words. Every evening she would climb a small dune at the edge of the village and speak quietly to the sky, offering prayers for rain, for health, for peace. It was said that when Sahira spoke, the wind would twist and turn around her, carrying her words beyond the horizon, and sometimes it even answered with gentle breezes that cooled the villagers' faces. Her father, the tribal chief, often watched her from the courtyard of their modest home, his heart swelling with pride. He would call her to sit beside him during council meetings, not because she had political power, but because her presence reminded men and women of patience, courage, and wisdom. Yet not all shared his admiration. Some villagers whispered behind cupped hands that her talents were unnatural, that a young woman whose words could tame the desert winds must surely consort with spirits beyond the human realm. Sahira, however, paid no heed to the gossip. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, her eyes reflecting both compassion and a depth of understanding that seemed beyond her years. She loved the desert with every fiber of her being. She would wander among the dunes in the early mornings, when the sands glowed like liquid gold, and listen to the whispers of grains shifting in the wind. Birds would circle overhead, calling back to her in trills, as if echoing some secret conversation. Even the sparse vegetation, the thorny bushes and resilient desert lilies, seemed to bend subtly toward her when she passed. Sahira's connection to the land was undeniable, a bond that filled the hearts of her fellow villagers with awe. They said that the desert itself watched her as she moved, that it knew her destiny long before she did, and perhaps even smiled when she laughed. Despite her popularity, Sahira felt the weight of envy in subtle glances and murmured rumors. Older women sometimes shook their heads when she was praised for guiding lost travelers back to the village, or for calming the tempers of quarrelsome herders. Young men would frown when she offered advice that revealed their own shortcomings. These minor slights, Sahira ignored with gentle grace, for she understood that the desert tested all who dwelled upon it, and the trials of the heart were often heavier than any scorching sun or treacherous sandstorm. Yet, in quiet moments beneath the great dunes, when the sun set in streaks of orange and purple, Sahira would speak to the wind alone. "Guide me, keep my people safe," she whispered, her voice trembling with the hope and fear of someone who carried more than her own life in her hands. And sometimes, as if in answer, the warm gusts would rise and swirl around her, playful yet protective, lifting strands of her dark hair and brushing against her cheeks with a softness that belied the harsh world around her. The villagers often noticed these phenomena but could not explain them, chalking them up to Sahira's charm or an uncanny coincidence. Only Sahira herself understood that the desert was alive in ways most humans could not perceive, and it had chosen to listen to her. Even as whispers of jealousy and suspicion grew among those who feared her growing influence, Sahira remained serene, her heart attuned to the rhythms of wind and sand, fully aware that her path was being watched by forces greater than any human malice. She did not yet know the trials that awaited her, nor the storms she would command, but the desert held her destiny in its silent embrace, and every shifting dune seemed to carry her name before she even spoke it aloud. Zara, the chief's new wife, entered the village with an air of elegance and authority, yet beneath her polished smile lurked a simmering resentment that would not be quelled. From the moment she arrived, she felt the weight of Sahira's presence as a threat to her own status. While the villagers admired Sahira for her wisdom, her gentle demeanor, and the uncanny way the desert seemed to heed her words, Zara saw only what she feared most: a rival whose light outshone her own carefully constructed image of power. Each day, Zara observed Sahira moving among the people, offering guidance, calming disputes, and speaking to the wind as though it were her servant. To Zara, this display of influence was intolerable. She could not comprehend the natural harmony that drew the villagers to Sahira, nor could she understand the bond the girl shared with the desert itself. In private, Zara whispered to members of the council, spinning stories of supernatural interference, warning that Sahira's actions might anger the gods. "Do you not see how she commands the winds?" Zara would say, her voice dripping with faux concern. "It is not natural for a girl to hold such sway. Perhaps she is a conduit for forces beyond our understanding, forces that could bring ruin upon us all." Her words, carefully crafted to appear cautious and wise, found fertile ground. The council, already wary of disturbances in the village, began to murmur among themselves. Zara's insinuations spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of villagers who once adored Sahira. When a sandstorm tore through the outskirts, flattening tents and scattering supplies, Zara's sly voice reminded them of Sahira's supposed power. "The storm came when she walked the dunes," she murmured. "Perhaps the gods are displeased with her." Fear gnawed at the hearts of those who had once trusted the girl who spoke softly to the desert, and slowly admiration shifted toward suspicion. Sahira noticed the change, though she did not fully understand its cause at first. Smiles were avoided, greetings were less frequent, and whispers followed her footsteps wherever she went. Even the children, once eager to play at her side, kept a cautious distance. Her gift, once a source of comfort and joy, became a source of fear in the eyes of those who misunderstood it. The wind that once danced merrily around her seemed to respond with a subtle sadness, as if sensing the turning tide against her. Zara's envy was insidious. She would sit by the council meetings, her eyes calculating, noting which villagers wavered in loyalty. Every gesture, every word from Sahira that drew attention became fodder for Zara's plots. She encouraged villagers to question Sahira's intentions, to doubt her knowledge of the desert, and to fear the girl's uncanny presence during ceremonies or communal gatherings. With each passing day, Sahira's position in the village shifted from cherished daughter of the dunes to someone whose mere existence provoked unease. Yet even as fear took root, Sahira did not waver. Her quiet walks along the dunes continued, her voice still rising in soft prayers to the wind. She listened as the grains shifted beneath her feet and the distant echoes of storms approached. The desert, always attentive, seemed to murmur reassurance, even as human envy attempted to choke her light. She understood, in a way that only someone in harmony with the land could, that this trial was the beginning of a greater challenge, a test of patience, resilience, and the true depth of her connection to the desert's power. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dunes, the villagers had begun to whisper among themselves, questioning the girl who once brought them hope. Sahira's eyes, however, remained calm, her heart steady, and her gaze lifted toward the endless sky. Though the seeds of envy had been sown, the winds carried her name across the desert, untainted by fear, and the dunes themselves seemed to promise that she would endure, even as human malice began to gather in the shadows. The day began like any other in the desert village, with the sun climbing high and casting long golden fingers across the dunes. Yet, beneath the scorching sky, an ominous tension had taken root. Zara, the chief's new wife, had spent the morning weaving her influence with careful precision, her honeyed words dripping with deceit. She spoke of omens and signs, claiming that the gods themselves were angered by Sahira's unusual connection to the desert winds. "The storms that sweep the dunes," she whispered with feigned concern, "they are warnings. The gods demand a sacrifice to restore balance. Only then will their favor return to us." The chief, a man of duty and superstition, felt the heavy weight of responsibility pressing upon his shoulders. He had always been proud of his daughter, of her gentle wisdom and the way she commanded respect without raising her voice. But the stories Zara told, the images she painted of divine wrath, unsettled him. Fear clouded his judgment, grief tugged at his heart, and uncertainty gnawed at his mind. He struggled to reconcile the love he felt for Sahira with the conviction that the gods must be obeyed. Every shadow cast across the dunes seemed to echo Zara's words, every whisper of wind carried the suggestion of doom. By mid-afternoon, a council had been convened. Elders and advisors, already wary of Sahira's unusual gifts, nodded silently as Zara recounted her tale. They spoke cautiously, fearing the displeasure of the gods and the possible destruction that could follow. Murmurs of assent grew louder, forming a chorus of consent for an action none of them wanted to take, yet none dared oppose. The decision was unanimous in appearance, though many hearts quailed in secret. The words rang in the air like a death knell. Sahira was to be taken into the deep dunes, left to the mercy of the sands, a sacrifice to appease the gods. Preparations were swift but somber. Sahira was led to the center of the village, her wrists bound with strips of woven cloth, her eyes covered with a veil that muted the light of the sun. Her feet sank into the sand as she was guided onward, each step a reminder of the fate imposed upon her by human fear and jealousy. Villagers watched in silence, some with tears glistening in their eyes, others with expressions of guilt that they could not hide. Even the children, who had once laughed and danced around her, stood frozen, unable to comprehend why the girl who spoke to the wind now faced such cruelty. The journey into the desert seemed endless. The sun dipped lower, painting the dunes in hues of blood and gold. With each step, the winds shifted as if sensing the injustice, carrying with them a low, haunting whisper that only Sahira could hear. It was the murmur of the desert itself, a voice both ancient and eternal, acknowledging her presence, comforting her, and yet warning those who had condemned her. The sand beneath her feet was hot and unyielding, but her spirit remained unbroken, a quiet flame in the face of human malice. As the tribe turned their camels and horses to retreat, Zara's satisfaction was palpable. She rode with a triumphant smile, certain that her machinations had succeeded. The chief followed, heart heavy, unable to see past the fear and the belief that obedience to divine will justify the act. The villagers too watched from the edges, some trembling with shame, others whispering prayers that the girl might somehow survive. But in the midst of despair the desert began to stir. The wind rose gradually, weaving through the dunes with a voice that grew stronger with each passing moment. It carried the faint melodic sound of Sahira's own breathing, mingled with whispers that seemed almost like laughter, a promise that she was not powerless, that the sands themselves would watch over her. The dunes shifted subtly, forming protective curves and gentle ridges that concealed her from prying eyes. Shadows lengthened as if the desert were gathering strength, a silent army of grains ready to defend the child who had always walked in harmony with it. As night fell, the sun's final rays kissed the sand with fire-red light, and Sahira stood alone, yet not unarmed. Though bound and veiled, her spirit connected with the vast expanse around her. The stars blinked awake above, and the wind carried a secret language she alone understood. In that moment, the desert ceased to be a barren wasteland. It became a living, breathing entity, alive with the memory of every storm, every shifting dune, and every whisper of wind that had ever danced across its surface. The tribe rode away, leaving her behind, confident in their judgment yet oblivious to the power they had unleashed. The wind shifted once more, swirling with a strength that only Sahira could feel. Each grain of sand seemed to pulse, alive and attentive, watching over her, waiting for the moment when the girl who had been abandoned would rise not as a victim, but as a force to command storms. The desert had claimed her, and in its vast, silent embrace, it whispered a promise. She would endure, and one day the winds themselves would answer to her. Sahira awoke to a world of scorching gold, the sun high and merciless above, burning the desert sky with an intensity that made even the sand shimmer with heat. Her body ached from the long hours beneath the blazing sun. Her throat was parched, and every breath seemed to draw fire into her lungs. Her skin prickled under the relentless rays, yet even in the face of such suffering, she did not allow herself a cry of despair. She had been abandoned, left to the mercy of the desert by those who once called her family, yet her heart refused to break under the weight of betrayal. Raising her head, she scanned the endless sea of dunes. Rolling hills of sand stretched in every direction, shifting like waves in a silent ocean. The horizon was a blur, each ridge dissolving into the next, giving the impression of infinity. For a fleeting moment, fear clawed at her chest. The desert was vast, uncaring, and merciless. But she drew strength from the rhythm of the wind, the whispers that had always seemed to respond to her presence. It was in these subtle voices, carried across the dunes, that she found the faintest flicker of hope. Kneeling, she lowered her lips to the sand and whispered, not a plea for rescue, not a cry for vengeance, but a request for dignity. "Grant me strength," she murmured, her voice nearly lost in the swirling heat, "to endure, to hold myself upright even as the world casts me down. Let me die with honor, if death is my destiny, and let the wind remember me." The words were soft, yet in their gentleness lay a profound resolve. She refused to allow despair to dominate her, to allow the cruelty of her stepmother, Zara, or the weakness of her father to define her. For hours she lay there listening. At first, the desert answered with silence, the only sound the whisper of sand shifting under the heat. Her eyes closed, she felt the dry grains against her skin, their warmth almost comforting in its persistence. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sand beneath her began to tremble. At first, it was so slight she thought she imagined it, a faint quiver, a ripple that passed under her palms like a heartbeat. She opened her eyes and saw that the dunes were subtly moving, the wind gathering momentum, curling around her in spirals that seemed deliberate, aware, protective. Her heart quickened. It was as if the desert itself recognized her, acknowledged her presence and responded to her plea. She stretched her arms, letting the sand slip through her fingers, and marveled at the strange, quiet energy building beneath her. The air shimmered, a wave of heat rippling in patterns that resembled fingers reaching out across the dunes. Each movement seemed purposeful, as though the desert was stirring to life, attentive to the girl who had called to it not with fear or anger, but with dignity and quiet strength. The longer she remained there, the more she sensed an ancient presence awakening. The desert was older than any person, older than any village, and its memory stretched beyond comprehension. Each grain of sand carried the echoes of storms past, of nomads and travelers, of survival and endurance. And now, it seemed, her spirit had been recognized within that vast consciousness. The tremors beneath her grew more pronounced, rolling across the dunes like the faintest pulse of a living being. She felt a warmth, not from the sun, but from the sand itself, coursing into her, granting her energy where before there had been only exhaustion. Sahira rose slowly to her feet, feeling the heat of the desert not as a threat but as a conduit of power. Each step she took was measured, careful, yet she sensed that the dunes shifted beneath her in response, guiding her path, creating sheltering curves, concealing her from sight. She inhaled deeply, drawing in the dry, electric scent of sand and sun, and realized that the desert had not left her to die. It had waited, watched, and now, in her moment of vulnerability, it was preparing her. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the dunes, Sahira felt the desert's consciousness entwining with her own. The tremors beneath her feet were no longer faint, they resonated with her heartbeat. The wind seemed to swirl purposefully around her, carrying with it the whisper of promise. She was not merely surviving, she was being chosen, blessed with the strength to endure, to rise, to command. The desert, vast and ancient, had stirred, and in its awakening, Sahira sensed that she was no longer alone. The sands had crowned her with silent power, a first whisper of the storms to come. As Sahira stumbled across the endless dunes, her body weary and her throat raw, she began to sense something unusual beneath her feet. The sand was no longer inert, merely shifting under the heat and wind. Tiny glimmers appeared, catching the sunlight in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like starlight scattered across the dunes. She paused, heart hammering, and knelt to touch the grains, feeling a subtle vibration beneath her palms. It was as if the desert itself held memories, ancient and patient, and now sought to communicate with her. The wind picked up, circling around her in gentle spirals that carried faint whispers. At first, they were indistinct, fleeting, like echoes of voices long gone. But as she listened, they grew clearer, carrying words that seemed to originate not from the air itself but from beneath the very sand. "We remember the one who listens," they said, soft yet compelling, brushing against her consciousness like a lullaby. Her heart swelled with awe and trepidation. She realized she was not alone, that the desert, in its vastness, had guardians, spirits of storms and sands, entities who had watched over forgotten queens and exiled children alike. From deep within the dunes, faint shimmering forms began to rise. They were translucent at first, flickering like sunlight on water, but gradually took shape, regal, ethereal figures with eyes that held the knowledge of centuries. Their presence was both calming and challenging. They radiated power yet demanded respect. Sahira understood immediately that these were not ordinary spirits, but ancient protectors who recognized her courage, her endurance, and her attunement to the desert's subtle song. The spirits tested her. Mirage after mirage unfolded before her eyes. The illusion of cool oasis waters, inviting shade under invisible trees, homes she had long known and loved. Each vision seemed designed to seduce her into complacency or despair, to make her abandon the harsh truth of her exile. Yet she resisted. With every mirage she denied, her inner resolve strengthened. She realized that to survive she could not rely on trickery or illusions, only on her own courage, her connection to the desert, and her steadfast heart. The spirits whispered guidance now, teaching her to feel the rhythms of the dunes, to hear the currents of wind as more than mere weather, but as messages and signals. They instructed her to walk in harmony with the shifting sands, to let her instincts and the desert itself guide her path. Sahira learned to sense subtle variations in the heat and vibration of the earth beneath her, interpreting them as signs of danger or direction. It was a slow process, demanding patience, humility, and trust in the unseen. Her courage awakened a force long dormant within the dunes. The sand rippled with new energy, currents forming shapes that mimicked her movements, as if acknowledging her presence and strength. Faint sparks of light flickered in the grains at her feet, hinting at the latent power she was beginning to command. Each step she took was deliberate, measured, and yet it felt as if the desert itself bore her forward, testing her will but also preparing her for what lay ahead. Sahira raised her arms, feeling the wind respond, circling around her with increasing intensity. The voices of the spirits grew stronger, harmonizing into a chorus that resonated with the very rhythm of her heartbeat. She could feel the desert's power flowing through her, not as mere energy, but as a bond between the living girl and the eternal sands. In that moment she understood that survival was no longer a passive act. It was an awakening, a communion with forces older than any human memory. As the sun sank toward the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the dunes, Sahira's spirit intertwined with the spirits beneath the sand. She felt a crown of invisible energy forming, a herald of storms yet to come, a recognition that she was not merely a victim of abandonment but a chosen one. The desert had acknowledged her, tested her, and now, through her courage and endurance, it began to share its long-hidden power. Sahira stood taller, her eyes reflecting determination and reverence, ready to embrace the storm that would define her destiny. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert's heat gave way to a cooler, expectant night. The sky, a vast expanse of indigo, began to pulse with a latent energy, the first whispers of a storm rising from the edges of the dunes. Sahira stood alone, yet she no longer felt abandoned. The spirits of the desert stirred around her, coalescing into currents of wind that lifted the grains beneath her feet into gentle, spiraling eddies. With each breath she took, she could feel the pulse of the desert echoing in her chest, a rhythm older than the village, older than her own life, now entwined with her heartbeat. Lightning cracked across the horizon, brilliant arcs of silver igniting the sky and reflecting in the sand like molten mirrors. The winds accelerated, responding to her presence, swirling around her with growing intensity, tugging at her hair and clothes, lifting her lightly from the ground. She felt no fear, only a deep resonance, as though the desert itself was acknowledging her courage and strength. Her tears, still warm from sorrow and endurance, fell onto the sands, and in that instant they transformed, no longer simple drops of water, but radiant grains of glowing light fusing seamlessly with the swirling winds. Each tear became a tiny beacon, illuminating the night with its luminescence, and the desert accepted them, integrating them into the very breath of the storm. The spiral of wind grew stronger, lifting Sahira higher, wrapping her in a vortex of light and sand. The spirits beneath the dunes sang in whispers carried by the wind, harmonizing with the rising storm. The sound was ethereal, vibrating through the bones of the earth, through her own body and into her soul. As she rotated gently in the air, the desert responded. The sands rippled in concentric patterns, mirroring her movements, as if acknowledging her as the rightful heir to its power. With every flicker of lightning, her figure became more radiant, more majestic, clothed in flowing dust that sparkled like starlight, a cloak forged by her endurance and the desert's favor. Her heart swelled with both sorrow and triumph. Every trial she had endured, the betrayal, the abandonment, the thirst and sunburn, had culminated in this moment. She understood that the storm was not merely a natural phenomenon but a manifestation of her own spirit, amplified by the ancient powers of the desert. The sands lifted higher, weaving around her like a living tapestry, sculpting her form into one of ethereal grandeur. She felt the crown forming upon her head, not of gold or jewels but of the desert itself, a regal corona of dust and swirling air, symbolizing dominion, resilience and newfound strength. The night sky blazed with streaks of violet and silver, the wind carrying distant thunder that reverberated in her ears like a chorus of long-forgotten voices. She extended her arms, and the currents of air and light seemed to respond, bending and spiraling with intent, as if listening to her unspoken commands. Her tears continued to fall, each one igniting a tiny flame of sandy light that merged into the storm's body, strengthening it and weaving it inseparably into her being. The desert no longer felt like a harsh, indifferent expanse. It was alive, aware, and it had chosen her as its conduit. By the time dawn approached, the transformation was complete. Sahira descended slowly to the sands, the whirlwind easing into a gentle, glowing wind that caressed the dunes. She looked upon herself and realized she had become something more than human, a queen born of trial and storm, a guardian of the desert's secrets. Her flowing garments of dust shimmered like the first light of sunrise on the dunes, and the crown formed from the desert itself glinted with an inner fire, a tangible reflection of her courage, resilience, and harmony with the elements. The desert was quiet now, yet it hummed with a latent energy that pulsed through the very grains beneath her feet. Sahira's eyes glimmered with the knowledge that she had survived the desert's trial, not merely by endurance but by embracing its spirit, becoming its living embodiment. The storm had crowned her, and the dunes whispered promises of power, protection, and respect, gifts reserved for those who had proven themselves worthy. She raised her hands, feeling the lingering warmth of her tears in the sand, and knew that from this moment on she would walk as the desert queen, the storm's emissary, carrying the strength of wind, sand, and ancient spirits wherever she tread. Sahira stood atop the highest dune, the desert stretching endlessly around her, each grain shimmering like molten gold under the first light of dawn. She had fully embraced her transformation, no longer the abandoned girl left to die by her own tribe, but the queen of storms, a living embodiment of wind, sand, and unyielding spirit. Her hair whipped around her face like tendrils of smoke caught in a breeze, and her garments of swirling dust clung and flowed as if alive, moving in harmony with the currents she commanded. Her eyes, alight with the energy of the desert and the storms it birthed, scanned the horizon with an authority that no mortal had ever possessed, and the air itself seemed to recognize her sovereignty. From the dunes below, nomads and wandering travelers stopped in awe, shielding their eyes against the blinding spectacle of sand and lightning coiling together like living serpents. They had come seeking passage across the harsh lands, but instead found themselves witnesses to a phenomenon beyond comprehension. Sahira's voice rang out, clear and resonant, echoing across the desert like the tolling of a great bell. Her words carried the cadence of thunder, and wherever her tone fell, the dunes trembled and lifted, sand spiraling into intricate patterns, and wind bending to her commands. The storm obeyed her, lightning tracing the path of her gestures, rain beginning to follow in scattered, sudden bursts, nourishing the parched earth as if the desert itself bowed to her will. Every movement Sahira made was a demonstration of mastery and grace. A gentle sweep of her hand could part a wall of sand, revealing hidden paths, while a stamp of her foot sent a pulse through the dunes, shifting their shapes and redirecting the wind. The storm's energy coursed through her, an extension of her very being, and each breath she took seemed to draw the desert closer, infusing her with its ancient power. She felt no fear, only clarity and purpose, knowing that her survival and her transformation were intertwined with the fate of these lands. What had once been her prison, the merciless desert that had been meant to claim her life, had become her throne and her realm. Stories began to spread almost immediately. Tribes who had doubted her, who had once abandoned or feared her, whispered to each other of a goddess risen from betrayal. They spoke of the girl left to die beneath the burning sun, now crowned with storms, commanding the very elements themselves. Each legend grew as more travelers encountered her presence. The desert could no longer be crossed without acknowledging the queen of storms, whose steps left flowers blooming in fleeting showers, whose laughter sparked lightning, and whose sorrow shaped the sand into dazzling, ephemeral sculptures. Yet Sahira did not wield her power for vengeance or caprice. She moved with purpose, her heart tempered by the trials she had endured. She guided lost travelers to water, redirected sandstorms that threatened villages, and whispered blessings into the wind that carried seeds across barren lands. Her connection with the storm and the dunes was not merely dominion, it was stewardship. The spirits that had first risen from beneath the sands now swirled around her like loyal attendants, their whispers weaving through the wind, amplifying her voice, and lending subtle guidance to her decisions. As Sahira walked across the horizon, the nomads followed in awe and reverence, witnessing a figure who was no longer wholly human, yet not wholly divine, a bridge between the mortal and the elemental, the past and the future. Wherever she passed, the desert itself seemed to bloom, the sand dancing with energy, and small rains falling from the clouds she commanded. The legends solidified in the hearts of those who saw her. Betrayal could birth resilience, cruelty could give rise to justice, and even the most desolate lands could crown a queen when one spirit was unbreakable. Sahira had transcended her abandonment, and in doing so she had become the enduring force of the desert, the queen of storms, whose power and grace would be spoken of for generations to come. Zara awoke to the shrieking winds that tore through the village, the sand stinging her face like 1,000 tiny knives. The once familiar dunes had become hostile, bending and swirling with an intelligence that chilled her to the bone. Tents that had stood for years collapsed under the unrelenting force of the daily sandstorms, wells that once held precious water ran dry, and the air itself vibrated with a strange resonance, a whispering hum that seemed to speak her name and the name of the girl she had betrayed. Each gust of wind carried the scent of the desert's fury, a tangible reminder that the girl they had abandoned was no longer powerless, and the desert itself had become her instrument of judgment. Inside the chief's dwelling, the man who had once held authority over the village tossed and turned in his sleep, tormented by visions of his daughter standing amidst the storm. Sahira appeared regal and untouchable, her flowing garments whipping around her like living dust, her eyes blazing with unyielding fire and the raw energy of the desert. In his dreams, she raised her arms and commanded the sand and wind to rise, the storm obeying her every movement. The dunes shifted into towering waves that crashed toward the village, a silent but terrifying admonition. Each night, the visions grew more vivid, more terrifying, until he awoke drenched in sweat, the taste of dust heavy on his tongue, and a gnawing fear lodged deep within his chest. Zara watched the chaos unfold from the edge of the dunes, her own heart pounding with guilt and dread. She had underestimated the bond between Sahira and the desert, the power of a spirit scorned but unbroken. She saw caravans overturned, livestock scattered, and the villagers cowering as the winds roared with unnatural force. Every tremor of the earth beneath the sand, every swirling vortex that tore across the plain, seemed to carry a message from Sahira herself. Justice was coming, and none who had betrayed her would escape its reach. Zara's earlier manipulations, whispers to the council, and schemes to remove Sahira's influence now appeared as trivial and insignificant in comparison to the magnitude of what the desert could achieve under her command. The villagers began murmuring among themselves, fear and awe intertwining in every conversation. "The desert watches her," they whispered, "she is its queen now." Some trembled as the winds tore through their homes, others fell silent, knowing that survival required submission to the power of a girl they had once scorned. Merchants abandoned their trade routes, fearing the wrath of storms that seemed almost sentient, while travelers turned back, unwilling to face the fury of shifting sands that were now the very tools of Sahira's vengeance. The chief, racked with guilt, could no longer ignore the signs. In the stillness between the storms, he heard her voice carried on the wind, calm yet unyielding, whispering of the pain of betrayal, the strength of endurance, and the inevitability of justice. He realized the full weight of his unforgivable sin. He had betrayed the daughter who had once been the pride and joy of his tribe, leaving her to perish in a desolate wasteland, trusting in the cruelty of others to seal her fate. The desert itself had become her ally, amplifying her sorrow and transforming it into a force that could no longer be contained. Zara's confidence and ambition, once a source of dominance over the tribe, faltered under the unrelenting power of the desert. Every plan she concocted to reclaim control or suppress Sahira's influence failed as the sandstorms shifted unpredictably, each gust carrying subtle reminders that the desert answered only to its true queen. Fear gnawed at her, a deep-rooted terror of a girl she had tried to destroy but who had risen from betrayal stronger than anyone could imagine. The winds seemed to mock her, sand scratching her skin like a relentless accusation, and even the chief could not look upon her with pride or command without acknowledging the enormity of his crime. As the sun set behind the swirling dunes, casting elongated shadows across the village, the people watched in reverent silence. Sahira's presence was everywhere, in the gusts that tore across the plain, in the glowing grains of sand that danced like sparks across the horizon, in the distant rumble of the desert's roar that seemed almost alive. The village had learned a lesson that could not be unlearned. Betrayal carries consequences, and the desert crowns those who endure its trials with unassailable power. Zara's unease grew with every shifting dune, every whispered echo, and every crackling spark of sand that seemed to bear Sahira's silent, unyielding judgment. By the time the first stars pierced the night sky, the chief and his wife understood that the girl they had left to die was no longer a mere mortal. She was the embodiment of the desert's fury, and the storms that followed bore witness to the justice that would not be denied. Sahira emerged from the horizon, a figure of radiant power against the endless dunes, her form cloaked in swirling sand and streaks of lightning that danced across the sky like liquid fire. The winds she commanded howled around her, lifting grains of sand into spiraling currents that seemed to obey her every movement. Each gust carried whispers of the desert, telling tales of her endurance, her betrayal, and the justice that had been long delayed. The villagers, caught between awe and terror, fell to their knees in unison, eyes wide, hearts pounding as if the very air demanded reverence. Mothers clutched their children, elders bowed low, and even the bravest of men could not meet her gaze, for in her eyes burned the fury of a storm and the unwavering strength of a heart that had suffered yet remained unbroken. Her father, the tribal chief, stood frozen, trembling with guilt and fear. His hands shook as he gripped the edge of his robe, the weight of his sin pressing down like the suffocating heat of the midday sun. He had abandoned the daughter he had once adored, allowing jealousy and deceit to dictate the course of his tribe, and now he faced her not as a child, but as a force of nature that could not be bargained with. His voice caught in his throat as he whispered her name, a plea that mingled with the moaning wind, and for a moment, it seemed as though the desert itself listened to his remorse. Zara, the stepmother whose envy had set these events in motion, crouched behind the remnants of a toppled tent, her eyes wide with terror. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but the sand underfoot seemed to shift with intention, forming barriers and currents that funneled her toward the village square. She had sought to control, to manipulate, to eliminate the girl she saw as a threat, yet here she was powerless against the embodiment of the desert's judgment. The glowing eyes of Sahira, reflecting lightning and molten sand, locked onto her, and Zara's breath caught in her throat as the full magnitude of her folly became clear. The storm itself seemed to pause, holding its breath in anticipation of Sahira's decision. The wind stilled just enough for the villagers to hear the subtle crackle of energy in the air, the faint hum of power radiating from her, and the weight of history pressing upon everyone present. In that moment, time felt suspended, as though the desert, which had watched silently through years of envy and betrayal, had called a halt to all chaos, allowing the truth to be fully witnessed. Sahira's gaze swept across the village, taking in the trembling figures of the people, the bowed heads of the council, and the fear etched deeply into Zara's face. Her voice rose, soft yet commanding, carrying over the dunes and into the hearts of all who listened. Each word resonated with the power of the storm itself, infused with the trials she had endured, the tears she had shed, and the indomitable spirit that had survived the desert's crucible. She spoke of justice, of mercy, and of the lessons carved into the sands by deceit and betrayal. The villagers understood that while she could unleash fury, she also offered the chance for understanding, a balance between retribution and wisdom. The air hummed as she extended her hand, and the winds responded, lifting dust into shapes that danced around her like living guardians. Grains of sand shimmered with the memory of her tears, reflecting the path she had walked from helplessness to sovereignty. The desert, in essence, became her crown, each gust of wind a jewel, each swirling vortex a testament to the strength she had forged through endurance. As the villagers gazed upon her, kneeling with faces pressed to the ground, the full scope of her power became undeniable. Her father's knees buckled beneath the weight of his remorse, Zara's spine stiffened in terror, and the villagers recognized that the storm was not merely natural, it was a living expression of Sahira herself. The sands whispered her name, the air carried her presence, and the horizon glowed with the reflection of her ascent. The storm waited, patient and obedient, for her final judgment, and in that suspended moment, all who had wronged her understood that the desert had crowned her queen, and no betrayal could ever diminish the might she had earned. Sahira emerged from the horizon, a figure of radiant power against the endless dunes, her form cloaked in swirling sand and streaks of lightning that danced across the sky like liquid fire. The winds she commanded howled around her, lifting grains of sand into spiraling currents that seemed to obey her every movement. Each gust carried whispers of the desert, telling tales of her endurance, her betrayal, and the justice that had been long delayed. The villagers, caught between awe and terror, fell to their knees in unison, eyes wide, hearts pounding as if the very air demanded reverence. Mothers clutched their children, elders bowed low, and even the bravest of men could not meet her gaze, for in her eyes burned the fury of a storm and the unwavering strength of a heart that had suffered yet remained unbroken. Her father, the tribal chief, stood frozen, trembling with guilt and fear. His hands shook as he gripped the edge of his robe, the weight of his sin pressing down like the suffocating heat of the midday sun. He had abandoned the daughter he had once adored, allowing jealousy and deceit to dictate the course of his tribe, and now he faced her not as a child, but as a force of nature that could not be bargained with. His voice caught in his throat as he whispered her name, a plea that mingled with the moaning wind, and for a moment, it seemed as though the desert itself listened to his remorse. Zara, the stepmother whose envy had set these events in motion, crouched behind the remnants of a toppled tent, her eyes wide with terror. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but the sand underfoot seemed to shift with intention, forming barriers and currents that funneled her toward the village square. She had sought to control, to manipulate, to eliminate the girl she saw as a threat, yet here she was powerless against the embodiment of the desert's judgment. The glowing eyes of Sahira, reflecting lightning and molten sand, locked onto her, and Zara's breath caught in her throat as the full magnitude of her folly became clear. The storm itself seemed to pause, holding its breath in anticipation of Sahira's decision. The wind stilled just enough for the villagers to hear the subtle crackle of energy in the air, the faint hum of power radiating from her, and the weight of history pressing upon everyone present. In that moment, time felt suspended, as though the desert, which had watched silently through years of envy and betrayal, had called a halt to all chaos, allowing the truth to be fully witnessed. Sahira's gaze swept across the village, taking in the trembling figures of the people, the bowed heads of the council, and the fear etched deeply into Zara's face. Her voice rose, soft yet commanding, carrying over the dunes and into the hearts of all who listened. Each word resonated with the power of the storm itself, infused with the trials she had endured, the tears she had shed, and the indomitable spirit that had survived the desert's crucible. She spoke of justice, of mercy, and of the lessons carved into the sands by deceit and betrayal. The villagers understood that while she could unleash fury, she also offered the chance for understanding, a balance between retribution and wisdom. The air hummed as she extended her hand, and the winds responded, lifting dust into shapes that danced around her like living guardians. Grains of sand shimmered with the memory of her tears, reflecting the path she had walked from helplessness to sovereignty. The desert, in essence, became her crown, each gust of wind a jewel, each swirling vortex a testament to the strength she had forged through endurance. As the villagers gazed upon her, kneeling with faces pressed to the ground, the full scope of her power became undeniable. Her father's knees buckled beneath the weight of his remorse, Zara's spine stiffened in terror, and the villagers recognized that the storm was not merely natural, it was a living expression of Sahira herself. The sands whispered her name, the air carried her presence, and the horizon glowed with the reflection of her ascent. The storm waited, patient and obedient, for her final judgment, and in that suspended moment, all who had wronged her understood that the desert had crowned her queen, and no betrayal could ever diminish the might she had earned. Sahira stepped forward, her presence commanding every gust and grain of sand around her. The dunes rose like living walls, forming spiraling columns that encircled the small clearing where her stepmother, Zara, and her father stood. The wind howled with a voice both ancient and relentless, carrying whispers of betrayal, injustice, and the silent suffering that Sahira had endured. Each particle of sand glimmered in the fading light, reflecting the memories of every slight, every cruel word, and every act of envy that had led to this moment. The very desert had become a witness, a judge, and a jury, its power now aligned entirely with her will. Zara cowered, her hands shaking as she clutched at the folds of her robe, her eyes darting around at the dancing sand columns, the lightning streaking faintly through the whirlwind. She opened her mouth to speak, but the wind seemed to carry Sahira's voice even before her own could form words. "You burned the innocent heart," it whispered, each syllable cutting through the oppressive heat, embedding itself into the consciousness of all who heard. The words echoed off the dunes, wrapping around Zara and pressing down upon her chest like a physical weight, leaving her gasping for breath. She fell to her knees, tears mingling with the grains of sand that clung to her trembling body, realizing that her envy and malice had summoned judgment far beyond her understanding. Sahira's father stood frozen, the agony of regret etched deeply into his features. His heart ached, for he understood that his weakness, his silence, had allowed cruelty to flourish in the name of obedience and misguided honor. The swirling winds carried Sahira's presence directly to him, brushing past his face and ruffling his hair, whispering his failures with gentle but unyielding force. He sank to his knees beside Zara, his hands scraping against the warm sand as though the earth itself demanded penance. His tears, heavy with sorrow, fell to the ground and immediately dissolved into dust, a symbolic manifestation of his guilt and the shattered trust that had once bound his family. Each droplet vanished before touching the sand fully, leaving behind only a faint trace of light that quickly faded, as if the desert was cleansing itself through the weight of his remorse. Around them, the sands shifted and shimmered, coalescing into ethereal shapes of villagers, spirits, and memories that had been wounded by betrayal. They floated like phantoms in the swirling wind, faces and forms bending and stretching, their eyes fixed on Zara and the chief. The air vibrated with murmurs, a symphony of accusation and remembrance, telling the story of every act of envy and negligence. The desert had become more than a landscape, it had become a tribunal, a living chronicle that refused to forget the pain inflicted upon its chosen daughter. Sahira raised her hands slowly, and the storm of sand responded, swirling faster, encircling the guilty and the witnesses alike. Her shadow, elongated and aflame with an inner fire, danced across the dunes, merging with the storm in a display of raw power and restrained wrath. She did not speak, for her silence carried more weight than any declaration. Every grain of sand seemed to carry her essence, and every current of wind whispered the truths that had been buried beneath years of deception. The desert itself was a mirror to their sins, and there was no escape from the judgment it demanded. Zara whimpered, her pleas growing desperate. "Forgive me. Please, I will do anything," she cried, but the desert remained impartial, the sands forming walls that pressed gently but firmly against her shoulders, urging recognition and acceptance of her crimes. The wind circled Sahira's father, lifting him slightly, forcing him to look upon the phantoms of suffering and betrayal, and he wept anew, this time understanding fully the consequences of his inaction. The storm around them intensified, lightning flashing within the twisting sand, illuminating the figures of judgment and the raw power Sahira had gained from endurance, grief, and the desert's own ancient magic. Finally, Sahira lifted her gaze, eyes blazing with the storm's fire, and the wind stilled just enough for her words to reach them. Though she spoke softly, her voice carried the authority of the desert itself. The trials of life are harsh, yet mercy can follow understanding. Let this be the lesson: where innocence suffers, the earth remembers. And those who betray must see their deeds reflected in its sands. The phantoms faded, the dunes settled, and the storm's fury abated, leaving Zara and the chief humbled, trembling, and forever marked by the judgment they had earned. The desert had spoken. The trial was complete. Sahira stood tall amidst the calm, her shadow at her feet, the wind still humming with the echo of her power. Her eyes swept across the village and the dunes beyond, the storm now a guardian and a crown, a testament to endurance, courage, and the unyielding strength that can arise from suffering. The sands had crowned her, the winds had answered, and justice had been fulfilled. Generations passed, yet the tale of Sahira, the woman who rose from the scorching dunes to command the storms, remained alive in the hearts of the desert people. Travelers along the endless sands would sometimes pause, eyes wide, as a sudden whirlwind spiraled in the distance, glinting gold in the sunlight. And there, at the center of the storm, moved a figure cloaked in flowing dust, her hair and garments caught in the wind as if the desert itself had woven her into its fabric. On her head rested a crown of glimmering sand, ever-shifting, reflecting the sun and moon alike, and her eyes sparkled with the calm authority of someone who had endured betrayal yet remained unbroken. They called her the Queen of Storms, a title carried on the lips of those who revered courage, justice, and the unyielding balance of nature. Stories of Sahira were passed down through generations, told beside campfires and in the quiet shade of oasis palms. Elders recounted how she had been left to die in the desert by those blinded by envy, yet how the very sands had chosen her as their sovereign. Children listened with rapt attention, imagining the whirling storms and the luminous crown, learning that true power often rises not from strength alone, but from wisdom, patience, and the purity of the heart. Teachers warned that betrayal and greed could never escape the memory of the land, and that anyone who harmed the innocent might one day face the relentless winds of reckoning. Her story was repeated not as a tale of fear, but as a guide to living with honor and empathy, a lesson carried on the whispers of the desert wind. Travelers who crossed the dunes swore that when a storm approached without warning, it was not merely weather, but Sahira herself passing through, testing the hearts of those beneath her sky. Merchants, nomads, and wanderers would feel a gentle gust lifting their hats, scattering their belongings momentarily, and hear the faintest echo of a voice carried on the wind, whispering caution, mercy, or guidance. It was said that the desert itself remembered every act of kindness and cruelty, and that Sahira, as the Queen of Storms, was both its guardian and messenger. Her crown of sand shimmered with the energy of the winds, a living testament to her triumph over adversity and the deep bond she had forged with the land. Villagers still spoke her name as a prayer when storms arose, invoking her protection or guidance in moments of peril. Mothers would tell their children, "Never betray one who listens to the wind, for the desert remembers," and the words carried a weight that transcended generations. Merchants crossing the harsh dunes would scatter offerings of water or small tokens, hoping to honor her vigilance and ensure safe passage. Every gust that stirred the sands was seen as a blessing or a warning from the Queen, a reminder that justice and mercy are intertwined, and that those who suffer yet remain steadfast may rise to command even the fiercest forces of nature. The legend of Sahira became a living tapestry woven into the desert itself. Sandstorms, once feared as mere natural fury, were understood as reflections of the Queen's watchful presence, her way of maintaining balance between human ambition and humility, cruelty and compassion. Travelers, villagers, and nomads alike learned to respect the winds, to tread carefully with their words and deeds, knowing that the Queen of Storms observed silently, her crown glinting like molten gold amidst the swirling grains. And though centuries passed and faces in the villages changed, her story endured, whispered whenever a storm approached, a timeless reminder that courage, integrity, and the strength of spirit cannot be buried, even beneath the harshest sands.